In this video, we're going to leave Europe behind and take a trip over to the United States of America. Over the last 150 years or so, music from the United States has kind of come to dominate music around the world. It's amazing, even if you travel to very far and distant countries, if you turn on a radio, chances are you might hear a piece of American rock or pop music. We're going to pick up this story in about 1870. This is a really important time in the history of America, as the country is just coming out of its Civil War. After a long struggle, African American slaves have been freed, and slavery across the whole country has been outlawed. So a lot of people think that the reason why so much exciting music came out from about this period onwards was because for the first time in the history of mankind, you had people from all different parts of the world and all different backgrounds starting to mingle together. And just as the same ways their cultures and religions and even cooking might have started merging and coming together in different ways, so too did the sorts of music that they were singing and playing. So if you were to go to somewhere like New Orleans in the southern states of America in around 1875, what kinds of people would you expect to meet? Firstly, the town would be filled with newly freed former slaves. These people brought with them a huge amount of musical heritage, going right back to their roots on the African continent. In addition, it's likely that they would have known a large number of what were called work songs that would be sung whilst out working through the plantations in the southern states of America. Work songs were generally easy to identify because they used what is called a call and response pattern to the music. There would generally be a leader who would sing a melody line. Then everyone else who was out working in the field that day would sing a response back. Performing music in this way was one way to pass the time whilst undertaking what was ultimately inhumane and backbreaking work. Once they were free from the oppression of slavery, African Americans were free to develop this music in new and exciting ways. While it wasn't possible to take musical instruments out into the plantation field, in the years that followed the end of the American Civil War, black musicians started learning instruments and developed accompaniments to these work song pieces. Over time, this new form of vocal and instrumental music became known as the blues, and more specifically in this part of the world, the Delta blues, named after the delta of the Mississippi River. Typically, unlike the work songs which required a large group of people to perform this call and response pattern of musical phrases, the blues can often be performed with a very small group of people, and even, perhaps, one singer, accompanying himself on the guitar. Perhaps the most important thing to remember when looking at this early blues music, and in fact all of the music that had come from the black community, is that it wasn't written down, it wasn't a notated music form, which means that you couldn't go and look up this music on a score and learn how to play it that way. You had to learn how to play this music by having experienced it and having someone teach you it directly. One of the common features of music that's like this, music that is what we call an oral tradition, is that often we don't have set pieces of music in the same way that we often think of Western classical music. Instead, improvisation is a really important part of the way the music is performed, and also the way that it develops. While some people have argued that a huge amount of American music is based on the foundations developed by the early blues musicians, to fully understand how we get to jazz, rock and pop music, we also need to understand the other people who were contributing their own musical cultures and heritage to the melting pot that was America at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. The European immigrant population in the United States comprised of people who came from pretty much every country throughout the European continent. These people brought with them a wealth of musical tradition and heritage, much of which we've spoken about in this series already. So in cities like New Orleans at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, black musicians with their emerging styles of blues music were living and working side by side with white musicians who might have been playing at opera houses or performing concerts around the city. In this kind of environment, it's not long before musicians start to borrow elements from each other's musical traditions to start exploring and developing new musical styles. Many of these new styles that begin emerging in the southern parts of the United States in the first decades of the 20th century are what we now call jazz music. While jazz music uses a huge amount of material taken from the blues, like the focus on improvisation and the relatively simple forms and structures, it also starts to explore more advanced harmonies and playing techniques that are taken from other styles of music, most notably Western classical music. During this time, we start to see the emergence of jazz players who have an incredible technique on their instrument. Take a look at Louis Armstrong, for example. He had a technique that was a rival to most of the classical trumpet players of his day. There's a huge amount of music which is full of exciting experimentation and exploration, which we know as jazz music, and I hope in the future to cover this very, very interesting area with a video series of its own. However, while jazz continues to develop throughout the 20th century, other musicians come along who want to make use of the exciting new developments in electronic musical instruments to produce some different sounding music. While a large amount of jazz music has focused on wind and brass instruments like the clarinet, the trumpet, and the saxophone, rock and roll, this new exciting emerging style of music that we start to see from the 1940s and 50s, is totally focused around the electric guitar. To fill a dance hall or large auditorium with sound, a jazz musician might have to bring up to 30 musicians along with him to make up a band in order to fill the space with sound. But quickly, rock and roll musicians realised that they could make just the same amount of sound with an amplified guitar, a singer using a microphone to amplify his voice, an electric bass player, and a drum kit player. So quickly, the sizes of ensembles that we start to see playing to large groups of people around the country begin to get smaller. Rock and roll musicians also introduced another very important development into their music. While jazz musicians tended to favour longer open structures because these were good for improvisation and it allowed them a good amount of time to develop their musical ideas, rock and roll musicians started to focus their musical compositions down to only a couple of minutes, maybe 3 or 4 minutes at the most. That made these compositions absolutely perfect candidates to be recorded onto a 7-inch record. These records would allow approximately 3 to 4 minutes of music to be recorded on each side. Anything longer than that would have to be split up. The relative ease with which people were able to record and reproduce all of this music meant that music stars like Elvis Presley became hugely famous the world over, and started what we might see as the modern period of American music history, that's still kind of going on today. During this period, the large record companies realised there was a huge market to be had from selling new and innovative music to young people. Another reason why this new emerging rock and roll music was incredibly popular was it was ultimately very simple. Record companies quickly discovered that they could sell far more copies of this simple, direct rock and roll music than they could of the more complex, sophisticated jazz music that was being produced at the same time. So driven by this huge desire to always be producing something new, we see a massive range of new musical styles and ideas emerging during the following decades, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, if you like. While these new styles often sound very different from one another, under the surface, the sorts of forms and structures that the musicians use in the music is actually very similar to those set up by the early rock and roll musicians. Until recently, things had carried on reasonably well, with record companies doing very well out of selling the music of a range of musicians working in different styles. Some people might have criticised them and said that the range of music they produced was too narrow and aired always towards the simpler end of music because that's the sort of music that people really enjoy listening to. And other more sophisticated music, like classical and jazz music, gets less attention than perhaps it should. But ultimately, we've been very lucky to have a great flow of new and exciting music for the last 40 years or so, coming from the basis of the fact that we can go and buy recordings of new music at our local record shop. But if we look to the high streets of the UK, the USA and other countries around the world, we see far fewer of the record stores that we were used to seeing only a handful of years ago. That's because the introduction of internet technology has completely shaken up the way that people are able to exchange music. Previously, to get hold of a new exciting recording, you'd have to go to the record shop and buy it. Whereas now, there are far more ways of getting hold of this. Some are legal, like the Apple iTunes Store, and some are illegal, with computer users sharing musical files between each other. So it's very interesting that I'm making this video on American musical history at this exact point in time, because it's definitely certain that this history has come to a very important point. Yet no one's quite sure how the future of music will continue. It's certainly true that we can now get access to a much wider range of music than was ever possible before. But what it does mean is that musicians are finding it increasingly hard to make money out of the sale of their recorded music. Personally, I hope that the result that internet technology will have on the music industry is that we'll return to a much simpler time that existed before recording became a mainstream way of distributing music. There is no more exciting experience than sitting in a concert or standing at a gig and seeing your favourite band or artist perform for you live. It's certainly becoming the case that to make a living as a musician, you're going to spend your entire life on the road. But this isn't a new thing at all. This is exactly what the travelling musicians in the 15th and 16th centuries did right the way across Renaissance Europe. They would move from place to place, singing their songs and telling their stories. And I hope that's exactly what we'll see in the future. We'll be able to find a fantastic array of music that can be ranging from very simple to incredibly complex and sophisticated, whatever suits our taste. And hopefully these musicians will be able to find a large enough audience to support the work that they do.